Real opportunity to make some significant changes in the makeup of the House and the Senate. Our guest speaker is the infamous Ben Tribbett. He's most famous for his old blog, Not Larry Sabato. Although I would say that I think Larry Sabato should open a blog and say, Not Ben Tribbett. Because this guy ran my campaign for Congress, and just a really neat guy. I'm happy to call him my friend. When you look at his analysis, especially when he does the analysis, he's usually spot on. And no one, I trust no one more than him when it comes to Virginia politics. So I brought him here tonight because of this historic opportunity that we have. He's going to talk about what happened in 2018 and how we're set up for 2019. So everyone, please give a nice round of applause to Ben Tribbett.
So 2019, one of the things you start with when we're talking about the General Assembly races this year is you need to remember that in 2011 when we had our last redistricting, the Democrats controlled the state Senate, the Republicans controlled the House delegates. So we're dealing with two very different sets of lines. While both chambers need 2 seats for Democrats to take a majority, one chamber is running under Democratic drawn lines, the other one's running under Republican drawn lines. So we have two of the probably most different chambers in terms of how those things were drawn of anywhere in the country. There's almost no one that has as much differential as we did. I think something like 1,400 precincts were split in 2011 between the two different chambers. I mean, it's just dramatic. So with those lines, one of the things that happened, is when the Republicans drew their lines, they took a 2-to-1 majority for basically the entire decade in the House of Delegates up until the last election. The Democrats under their lines lost the majority they won under Republican drawn lines and never won it back. And a lot of people, I think the first thing to say is, why don't we have a Democratic majority in the state Senate if we drew the lines, first of all? And the main reason for that is that Democrats in the Senate sort of adopted a Republican approach to redistricting. And when I say Republican approach, what I mean is Democrats did very well in 2007 because the Republican districts for the Senate were very compact and they were communities of interest. And what you see in Republican primaries now is that communities don't matter, ideology matters. So when you have a compact district, the Republicans are going to nominate an ideological candidate, the Democrats are going to tend to nominate somebody from the community. In 2011, when the Democrats redrew the Senate, they decided to go more with partisan lean in precincts than with communities of interest. And when they took those communities of interest out of districts, they no longer could have candidates that were centered in those communities, and they lost the seats. So they actually, for example, Ed Houck, who had been a state senator for 30 years in the Spotsylvania area and was known by everyone in Spotsylvania County, I mean, probably the most well-known political figure in that area, lost his seat in 2011 because they drew out a number of areas he used to have and drew him up to more Democratic precincts towards Albemarle. Which he won, but by very small margins. The precincts in between, they drew in between, he was crushed in, and without the community of interest, his numbers fell off the charts where he had always been very strong because he was no longer centered there. And we saw the same thing with Roscoe Reynolds, who was a Democratic state senator from the Martinsville area, and instead of representing Martinsville and Henry County, which he had always represented, the Democratic plan drew Martinsville and Danville together, which are on a map look like logical, but in Southside that is a long distance between them. There's two very different communities. And again, what you saw was Roscoe won the Democratic precincts, but with reduced margins in both because he was trying to campaign in two different areas and was just annihilated in the middle and lost the seat. So under those lines, what I think people should infer from that and learn from it is nonpartisan redistricting actually benefits the Democrats even when it's not necessarily on paper a partisan influence right now. That won't always be the case, but when you have Republican primaries that nominate really ideological candidates, that is something where we have the advantage. And if you look at 2007, who picked up the seats in the state Senate, what we saw was it was all people that were centered in their communities that were well known, that were able to pool independent votes. And in Virginia, independents are everything. We look at numbers on election day and we think, okay, well, here's what Democrats got, here's what Republicans got. You can't pull independents from that, right? You said they went one way or the other. But the reality is when you poll, what you find now is that a big chunk of the Democratic vote is actually independents. Democrats in Virginia have been winning independents by a 2 and 3 to 1 margin now for almost 15 years. So Republicans actually still in a lot of these areas have more voters than Democrats do on paper of what they would identify as. But Democrats get more votes because they carry the independent votes so overwhelmingly. Statewide, that's still the case, where if you do a statewide test, you're still probably going to find, depending how you run it, and it's getting close now for the first time in high turnout elections, there's still more Republicans in Virginia than there are Democrats. It's just the Democrats win the independent vote so overwhelmingly that Democrats carry the state. And so in the marginal legislative districts, that really gets amplified because what we're looking at is districts when they are on the margins that are actually in polling +8, +6, +10 Republican districts in terms of party identification with an independent population that leans Democratic that tends to pull them closer. So in the 2017 cycle, it really was a missed opportunity for Democrats in the state because the governor's win was historic. The House of Delegates win was not historic, okay? It was the Democrats and House of Delegates targeted 6 seats that they put most of their money and resources into and picked up all 6. All 6 seats they targeted, they won by double digits because the year was so great. The marginal seats that they carried, for the most part, were untargeted by the Democratic caucus. And they came in anyway on election night. And the seats that were the absolute closest of them all got 0 support. Places like Fredericksburg with Josh Cole, who lost by, I think, 89 votes or something. I mean, that race wasn't even on the radar screen, even though the Fredericksburg seat has been, for the last 15 years in every statewide election, an extremely competitive statewide seat. It was not a mystery to people that around the Fredericksburg area, especially with Mary Washington there, that this was going to be politically competitive. It also wasn't a mystery to people it was an open seat, and there's usually very little crossover in open seats. People generally vote the up ticket. But for whatever reason, the caucus didn't even play there. And I think this is something you see in Virginia a lot, where the Republicans can take a bad candidate, and you wouldn't know it. They'll still back him. So their candidate can have 2 DUIs and an assault charge against a police officer or whatever. And no one is going to break with them. No one's going to say a word about it. They're going to do their mail. They're going to turn out their base. Their voters are going to stick with them. Democrats, the person has a bad speaking engagement somewhere, and people say, oh, they can't win. They're not inspiring. I don't know, like, you know, we should have had a better candidate. Maybe we'll do someone again 2 years. Yeah.
Do you happen to know off the top of your head what the statewide popular vote in 2017 was for the House of Delegates?
No, but the statewide popular vote was really skewed because there were so many districts where the Republicans didn't contest. So, like, it really would be meaningless. And like Patrick, you know, was unanimous. He would get 75% if he was contested, but almost all the Democrats were unopposed, so there's it's not really relevant. No. So what we saw in all the marginal House districts was they all ran behind Governor Northam, but not by a lot. So when you see at the end of the day where resources could have gone, if you could take a snapshot, and obviously all these things are 20/20 in terms of hindsight, but really the Democrats had probably 58 seats in play in the House of Delegates in 2017 and won 49 of them. It could have actually been a monstrous Democratic majority. If you take the type of seats Democrats took for Congress in 2018, Democrats would win 63 seats in the House of Delegates. Because we were actually winning in the congressional election not only the Hillary districts, which is all we picked up in the House of Delegates in 2017, but actually the very close marginal Trump districts, none of which we took in the 2017 elections. So the reason for that is when the Republicans drew their lines, the seats are all clustered together. There's not much differential. So while they drew it in Republican advantage, once that tide hits and they all flip at once. So you can go, for every point, you're flipping another 5 to 7 seats in the House of Delegates until you get to about 75 seats. And then there's about 25 that are in far southwest Virginia that are completely out of reach. But basically all of the suburban seats in the state are within play for the Democrats if you look at where we were in 2018 in the election. Now, how many of those will actually be contested is probably a big question as well. because so many of the candidates didn't get support last time, then candidate recruitment becomes difficult in those seats. And there's a lot of places where, you know, for example, Fredericksburg, you know, we had an 80-vote election. I'm not sure, you know, I don't want to put Patrick on the spot, but I'm not sure that the Democratic caucus supports Josh Cole running again. I'm not sure the leadership supports him running again because they don't think he's a great candidate, but they also don't want to recruit a primary challenger to him. So in a lot of ways, they're already writing off one of the closest seats from the last election, assuming that it's not going to be close this time. That seat also is a really interesting one because the Republican incumbent came in and voted for Medicaid expansion and is now facing a primary from his right. So you could end up with a situation where the Democrats have a candidate on the ballot who they don't believe can win and aren't fully supporting, with a Republican incumbent taken out in his primary with a very weak challenger on the ballot against him. And unfortunately, that's a lot of what we see in House delegates. Now in the state Senate, we don't see this as often. We actually have a lot more luck with candidate recruitment in the state Senate. And you could attribute that to a lot of different factors, but I think the main factor is that the state Senate has a better reputation in the state of supporting candidates in marginal seats regardless of how they perform. They don't generally throw people under the bus. And they usually, if they're backing you, they stick with you throughout the cycle. And so there's a lot of people who prefer a state Senate election versus a House of Delegates election. That's just where we've seen, you know, the elections go and where leadership's taken it. So that's the big picture on the field. When you get into the individual seats, what you're going to see is, you know, in the state Senate, we all know Dick Black in Northern Virginia, obviously one of the most marginal seats. A lot of people wonder, you know, how does Dick Black get elected to begin with? And the short answer is that in the 33rd Senate District, which he represents, when you get into low turnout elections, the electorate becomes so old. The median age, I think, of voters in Dick Black's district last time was in the low 70s in his state Senate district. And this is a Senate district that's primarily in Loudoun County, one of the youngest counties in the country. But his electorate was extremely old. And that demographically is very different, especially in the outer suburbs. Sean Connaughton, who was the chairman of Prince William County, Republican, talked about this 15 years ago when he gave a speech about the demographic tidal wave hitting Prince William County, how their senior population was over 80% white, and their school population was overwhelmingly majority minority, which tells you what the population was of the young parents who lived in the county, and what that meant in terms of their elections. So what we've seen in Prince William County is every time there's an off year election with low turnout, which is primarily the older voters, Republicans continue to win the county. They held a majority on the county board there since 1999. They have very good local elections in Prince William. When you get into presidential level turnout, the Democrats win Prince William off the charts. When we get good gubernatorial level turnout, like we did with Ralph Northam, Democrats win it off the charts. And the reason for that is that even in the lowest turnout elections, the vast majority of seniors vote. So it's really just all a turnout game there. I mean, like, the Republicans run out of votes really fast. They have an advantage in the lightest turnout, but then they don't have anywhere else to go. And what's happened in the rest of the county is it's so demographically different at a younger age that they don't even have, you know, options of how to do this. So whether you look at, you know, Scott Lingenfelter, House of Delegates, or Jackson Miller, or Bob Marshall, or any of these Republicans who lost their seats in Prince William County last time, they were all waiting to lose their seat. None of them was ever winning crossover votes. They were just up in elections where there was light turnout and where the older voters were the primary driver. The first time they faced an election that was going to have a larger turnout with a more representative sample of what the county looked like, they were all going down together. They all knew that from the start. Somehow they knew that and we didn't, which is one of the big stories of 2017, because the Republicans seemed to have a better idea from my reporting on in the morning of 2017 of what was happening than we did. The Democrats were still fighting. I mean, they were sending out canvassers into Carrie Delaney's district at 4 p.m. She won by 16 points. Tim Hugo's district next door, which he won by 101 votes, I think was the final margin. Democrats really were sort of meh. We're not going to be able to take that this year. So they seem to have a much better. Meanwhile, Republicans were doing the exact opposite, by the way. The Republicans were pulling out all their people, sending them to Hugo that day. which is when I was on Twitter live tweeting this, saying like, this could be a good indicator, maybe we should just, follow them. Where are they going? They seem to have better data, where are they going? And they were all headed to Tim Hugo's district. You actually could see it live right on social media, where every Republican you would know suddenly had been somewhere in the morning and appeared in Centerville in the afternoon. So the reason that, using Tim Hugo as an example, that his race became as close as it did, so like the Centerville area in Fairfax County, same thing as Prince William County, same thing as Loudoun out in western Fairfax. The younger population is overwhelmingly Democratic. The older population is overwhelmingly Republican. So I don't know how many people in here know Dan Lagana, who's the Fairfax County Democrats chair. He ran the GOTV for Democrats in western Fairfax in 2015, which is the last time we had a local election there. And I think ran the best GOTV program that they had ever had in western Fairfax that year. I mean, it was really off the charts in terms of what they were able to do. And in those Centerville precincts, they were able to, by just dragging voters to the polls, get margins for the Democratic candidates about 150 or 200 votes per precinct. Dante Tanner was winning them by 800 or 900 in the gubernatorial year. The amount of Republican voters that was the difference between the Republican vote in the off year and the governor's year was about 100. The Democrats' difference was everything else. So you get to a point where in these elections, when you have, literally the outstanding vote, once you get past the expected vote, is as Democratic as you would find in Anacostia. I mean, like I'm not even saying Arlington. I mean, it's 90 plus. I mean, it's almost no signs of Republicans, period, right? And parts of Prince William County and Loudoun now are actually bluer than Arlington. I mean, and this is what's changed so quickly. I mean, you go to Woodbridge, and it's off the charts Democratic. Some of the precincts are in the mid 80s. They outperform anything, inside the Beltway. And that's something that we've seen. Those same precincts were voting Republican 10 years ago. So it's all right now becoming about what's shifting, who's coming out, and turnout for the Democrats in these elections. Now, the challenge in 2019 is turnout's going to fall off. We know turnout's going to fall off. We know it's not going to be at 2017 numbers. And that's why it's going to be so difficult to take back the House of Delegates versus take the state Senate. Because the state Senate lines are more favorable to us. They're not great, but they're more favorable in a low turnout election cycle. The House of Delegate lines all break with high turnout. So if we're able to generate a large turnout in 2019 that looks more like 2017, the House of Delegates will be in play very quickly. And the Republicans really don't have any way to combat that. But without turnout being at those levels, the Republicans have an instant advantage in every one of these districts because anything that comes down in turnout is Democratic vote. I mean, it's almost 100%. So this is something, it's new, it's unique. I've been doing this for 20 years. I mean, it used to be that this would happen, but it was at 60, 65%, 70%, not at 90%, right? And so with those voters that you had to bring out, you would have to identify them. And you would have to know which ones were yours to bring them out. We're getting to a point now where I'm not even sure that identification even matters anymore in terms of elections, that literally just turning people out is now the best way for Democrats to go in these seats because the outstanding vote is so overwhelmingly Democratic that it's more Democratic than your GOTV precincts are to begin with. And if you can get out a handful of those voters, with the sorts you can do in Van, you oftentimes can get an electorate that's 94 or 95% Democratic just by taking the outstanding vote. Gordon's standing here, who's the chair of the 100 Mill Dems in Fairfax, and we're seeing this happen in Reston and in Vienna and in all these places that are historically competitive. They're not competitive anymore, but they're not competitive because of independent voters. It's not that they're not overwhelmingly Democratic. These are mostly, our Democratic vote now is getting driven out of upper income precincts. This is not historically the Democratic coalition. In Ralph Northam's campaign, he had precincts where he had return rates from Hillary Clinton at 97 and 98% of the voters coming back in the presidential and the highest income precincts. and in the 60-65 range when you went down into more moderate income precincts in Northern Virginia, which 60 to 65 is really good for a governor's election historically. But we've never seen anything like the way that high income voters have reacted to Donald Trump. They obviously, though, are not in every legislative district. And those districts that have the highest preponderance of those types of voters that are the most motivated by Trump tend to already be represented by Democrats. So, for example, you don't see a bunch of really high-income precincts in the Fredericksburg district. You don't see a lot of really high-income precincts even in Dick Black's district, maybe a handful, but not very many. So we have to be able to rely on a different coalition than what has pushed us in the statewide elections to win the legislature. And I think this is the biggest area of confusion for people is like, how can we not have these things when we win statewide, we win easily? And so the short answer to the question is, one, we don't do a good job gerrymandering. Two, we don't have a even spread of our voters in the swing districts. And three, when you have these elections, I think the Democrats do a much worse job of standing behind their candidates than the Republicans do. And that affects not only that particular election, but then the subsequent ones in terms of candidate recruitment. So, big picture, is that answer that good, 29?
Well, yeah, that's good. But getting to the point, getting to